Level up your LA Kings experience with Vivid Seats Elite Seats. All the on-ice Kings action with even more exclusive access and rewards. Enjoy great seats to the game in Section 103 along with Yamava Club access and parking included with your purchase. Plus, get a free Team LA Kings shop item at the game. Score your Vivid Seats Elite Seats tickets today and earn perks on each purchase from the only leading ticket company with a rewards program. Experience it live with Vivid Seats, the official partner of the LA Kings. Do you know the LA Kings have their own culinary partner? It's Superfood, celebrating 10 years and over 1 million meals served. Since 2020, the Kings have trusted Superfood to fuel their players. Now through Simply Lunch, you can bring that same performance-driven food to your office. Because when people eat better, they work better. Visit mysuperfood.com. That's mysuperfd.com. Or call 213-973-6145. Qualified companies can enjoy a free lunch for up to 10 managers.
You're listening to All the Kings Men, the official podcast of the LA Kings. Now, here's your host, Jesse Cohen.
Welcome back, Kings fans. This is another episode of All the Kings Men. Joining us today from FloHockey, Chris Peters. How are you doing today, Chris?
I'm doing well, guys. Good to be with you.
And, of course, featuring Zach Dooley. How are you doing today, Zach?
If I forget that Chris is with FloHockey, I'll just look at the lid and we'll immediately know.
Look, Chris, we're talking to you today, which this is on us. Generally speaking, means we're either right before or right after the draft.
Yeah, pretty much.
So the 2026 NHL Entry Draft, it takes place this Friday. Round 1 is Friday. Rounds 2 through 7 are Saturday. And my first question, so we're recording this Monday, the 22nd. And, of course, yesterday was the bombshell trade of Brady Tkachuk from Ottawa to Florida. We are, and presumably one of the events that facilitated that trade was a different trade of his brother Matthew Tkachuk from Calgary to Florida a few years ago. We know that Hughes was traded from Vancouver to Minnesota. We have heard rumor that Connor Hellebuck might be traded from Winnipeg. If you are one of the 7 Canadian teams, does the last few years of trade behavior and contract behavior make you think differently about drafting an American-born player?
I think it has to affect you a little bit. I think the important thing to remember, though, is that all of those teams got some really good years out of those players. Mm-hmm. And so the question is like, all right, I'm drafting a guy, and we talk about like, what's he going to be in 5 or 6 years, Well, in a lot of those cases, they were impactful players over multiple years, played significant roles in their teams, and ultimately were traded, for, presumably helpful assets. I guess the jury's a little bit out still on Calgary's, return and other things of that nature. And, I think that GMs have certainly gotten a little bit better at, even when these trade demands are made, not, making that trade for pennies on the dollar necessarily, and trying to make sure that there's, a reasonable return. So I would say, like, you always have to get the best assets, but I do think building for the long term is important. And especially if you're a team like Winnipeg, where you're not getting free agents and it's hard to, you're on everybody's no trade list and all these other things that makes things difficult, particularly for them. I think also there's the other issues like the tax issues and other things that the players are cognizant of, the media landscape. There's a lot of different reasons for it. But I think in these specific instances, I think like the Vancouver situation was just kind of like a cascading of errors that happened that basically led to the Quinn Hughes leaving. You can't really account for how much somebody wants to play with their brother, if you're Ottawa. So you can't necessarily just pass up those players and say, well, we're just going to take the next best Canadian. Now, I do think it gives you a little, maybe you put those Canadian players a little bit higher on your board than you do some of those American players, so that you're making those decisions with the full understanding that, hey, this guy might not be here for the term of their contract. And, but I think a lot of times, like, I would, if I'm the Ottawa Senators, I don't know that I trade the 7 years or 8 years that I had with Brady Tkachuk for, as if it were, a waste or anything like that. Like, I think that's an important thing, is that these guys did play a long time. I mean, Connor Hellebuck has won multiple Vezina trophies as a member of the Winnipeg Jets. It kept them open. Their window was open. Now their window is closing, it feels like. And so that precipitates the move as opposed to him really just not wanting to be in Canada. I think that's the other thing is like, not all these trades are because the guy doesn't want to play in Canada. I think a lot of them are comfortable with that. But I do think it impacts, like, there's a lot of other things like Matthew and Brady Tkachuk are probably going to be able to increase their earning potential outside of hockey together in Florida more than they would separate with one on the other side of the border. So, like there's a number of other things that kind of come into play as well. But I think it's a very valid question. And I think it's something that teams are considering. And the other thing that I keep hearing is like, these American players is not just about Canadian teams specifically. A lot of American players are trying to dictate their next moves. I just think it's more players are feeling empowered to finally kind of say, whatever control or leverage we have, we're going to use it. And that's the new world.
I've been saying this for a few years now. The NBA to me is the canary in the coal mine on labor relations because they have fewer players, bigger contracts, and everything is just sped up. Once you have a player who gets generational wealth by his second contract, there's no leverage that management has on them anymore. They can not force, but they can try and work their way to whatever team they want.
Yeah.
And all I could think of, as you were talking about, was the Ducks when Scott Niedermayer joined his brother, Rob Niedermayer. And prior to that, I don't think anybody had the Ducks high on anybody's list of like destination teams, but the flip side of that, then you were talking about Canadian players, is now that the NCAA rules allow CHL players to join the NCAA, does that turn GMs off from Canadian born players? Like now are we just going to put a premium on European born players because their options are more limited than North American born players?
No, I think that the way that a lot of teams are looking at it is, in a lot of these situations, a lot of players are playing their draft seasons in junior and then maybe playing the following season in college, or some of them are going to college a year early to get in there. And I think that generally NHL teams are fine with that move. Essentially, I do think that it does make it a little bit, we look at the WHL numbers this year, and I would say like their numbers were very inflated. And so it's kind of, you have to recalibrate kind of how you're looking at the, if you're doing things like NHL equivalencies and other things and accounting for the new kind of strength of schedule and different things like that. But I do think it's changed the dynamic of just in terms of how people are viewing the next steps for players. I think that think about the number of players that were rushed into the NHL from the CHL that were not ready for the NHL, but probably too good for the CHL. Well, now there's a hybrid option, and that's what they're viewing college as. And I think that a lot of teams are very comfortable with their players going the college route for a number of reasons. One, it's a year where they don't have to spend one of their contracts on a player, because there is a limited amount of contracts that each team gets that they have to stay under that number. That's 50, another year. Right? Yeah, it's 50. Yes, exactly. Thank you. 50 for that nice, even, round number. So now you get that player, you stash that player for a year. That's free development essentially from another place. I think a lot of teams are very comfortable with guys developing in college. And so now the post-draft work has changed a little bit, but a lot of the pre-draft work really remains the same. And I think a lot of teams were happy to see Gavin McKenna go challenge himself in college hockey and have some struggles at times. I think that we learned more about Keaton Verhoff because he was in college. Maybe didn't help his draft stock, but I don't think teams care about the draft stock as much as they do where is he going to be in a couple of years. So those are the things. And some teams will just be like, hey, it was a kind of not an amazing year, but it wasn't bad. So we're still going to take that player. So I think there's it feels like there's more positives for the NHL than there really are negatives at this point on that player flexibility beneath the league.
So Chris, all the things that Jesse mentioned, and there's even more than that, are different in this draft. It's the first year that, 19-year-old CHL players can play in the AHL.
Yeah.
There's different eligibility and draft rights lengths. On the more NHL side, the free agent class is weaker because the cap is rising and there's going to be more trades. All of those factors happening within 12 months. This is kind of the first draft where these things are coming into play. As a talent evaluator, have all of those factors made this a harder draft to predict because there are so many more like first times and unknowns than we've seen in past years?
I think to a certain extent. I mean, I think that really you have to do that every year because there's players coming from all these different levels and different ways, and they're doing things at different times. And evaluating a high school player versus a junior player versus a college player or versus a player that's played European pros. So I think that in terms of that, the only thing that I think it has done is like for the players that are playing in the tougher leagues, you get a little bit better data on them, a little bit, because sometimes they don't play enough to like where you're like, oh, I don't really know what the benefit or what that player ultimately is. So I think that that's part of it. But largely things haven't really changed a whole lot in terms of how you have to do the job, because every single league has to be, the context of that league has to be understood before you can really evaluate the player. So I think that's another thing that I tend to think about a lot is just, where they are, their environment, who their line mates are. That's all part of the evaluation process. So you're already kind of doing that. And I do think like it does impact things a bit more in terms of those next steps. And I think it puts a little bit more of the onus on the player development staffs within teams to like, hey, let's make sure we're checking in on this guy who's now not in our AHL team, but at a college program. And then maybe he'll be on our AHL team next year. So, there's a lot of new things that I think everybody's kind of adjusting to, and we still don't really know the impact of all of it. Like, who benefits, who loses, all those different things. Like there's always something to that. I think it's still going to be a few years before we truly know the effect of that.
Zach mentioned a lot of the landscape changes that we have known about, right? That were negotiated in, and we've had time to talk about it and think about it and fantasize about what the impact would be. But there's also stuff like, okay, Florida acquires Brady Tkachuk, Ottawa allegedly also looking to quote unquote upgrade on Jordan Spence. Does that change whether or not Ottawa is rebuilding? Carolina wins the Stanley Cup. What does that do to the teams in their division? If Winnipeg does look to move Hellebuck, does that change whether or not they're rebuilding? If Detroit moves Larkin, like you could have 4 or 5 teams suddenly explode out of the last 2 months as, either rebuilding or fundamentally, like I won't say Ottawa's rebuilding, but if Ottawa does move one of the 3 first-round draft picks that they got in the Tkachuk trade to acquire a different player, well, they've fundamentally changed their path, their franchise path. Does that impact how you prepare for the draft? Looking at, okay, all of a sudden this team has a bunch of first-round picks. That team might be looking to, 3 months ago, I wouldn't have thought of Ottawa as having 3, of having all those picks.
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought of that a couple days ago. So like, it's kind of like, it's kind of, it doesn't really impact the way that I do things. Like obviously, like if I do a mock draft, it's going to change, that'll change, and you're saying, okay, well,
but that could have huge changes. No, like if,
for sure. The teams that are there, like, it's like, okay, well, their needs might be a little bit different, or the way they draft might be a little bit different, or the kinds of players they're typically searching for might be a little bit different. So that does make things a little more challenging on that front. I think when it comes to the player, like for the player side of things, and it doesn't change a lot, but it does, you look at Winnipeg and like, let's say they do move Connor Hellebuck, like that is a seismic shift in that franchise. And it does significantly change the outlook of what they're doing and
a seismic change to whatever division he winds up in.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and to whatever team he goes to, there's all these different things that kind of come into play and, that are massive differences. And like, it just seems like that's what we're headed for. Like, will Dylan Larkin move before the draft? Will all these other things happen? So there's a lot of variables that you can't control. So the thing that I try to focus on going into the draft is just kind of being dialed in on the players, and also dialed in a little bit on where the teams are and what they need and things like that. So I think, like, let's say Ottawa does end up making all their picks, they have a chance to get a pretty significant prospect at number 9 if they should choose to keep that. But that they also have, they can't trade the 32nd pick, but they can trade the other one. So they have 2 picks that they can potentially move in a move up situation. So like, there's all sorts of different scenarios that could potentially play out that do play into their hands a little bit. But and the way that Steve Staios is talking, as far as Ottawa is concerned, it sounds like the rebuild is not happening. Like they want to stay competitive. And, that's a big hole to fill in their lineup, but it's also not something that I think that will be filled with a draft pick unless they were to move those picks.
I'm going to ask this question to both of you. We'll start with Chris. Have you ever written a really long story or article and then realized about a paragraph away from finishing it that you changed tenses halfway through, or that you've left out some crucial piece of information that requires a tense change early on, and then you have to go back down and like change everything after it, and you're just gutted that you didn't like that you realize, oh man, I have to make a change 2 paragraphs in that changes everything that comes after it?
Yeah, I mean, like pretty much every mock draft I've done has had,
Zach, you must have
basically that same thing. Yeah.
I can't say I've had it with a tense. I mean, I've
formatting
had like
maybe.
I've had stories that I've put a lot of work and thought into, and then it gets blown up and never used for one reason or another. But never one where I've just had to edit the tense of something
or formatting. I mean, I guess what I'm getting at, Chris, is like, had you sat down and looked at the entire draft order and gone, well, okay, Florida at 9, this is where they're at. What do they think? And so they'll take this player, and then number 10. Like, once you disrupt the 9th overall pick,
it's like a butterfly effect, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, everything after that kind of gets thrown out. No,
the good, right? But I'd say the good news is like basically every mock draft I did, I kind of did with the assumption that Florida was going to move that pick at some point. Right. So it was kind of like, and I also think that in that range, once you get into the 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 kind of area, there's really like 4 or 5 guys that are universally in that slot. And so it probably doesn't change a whole lot in the end. Just because I think that there's a belief that like the 13 guys, there are like 13 guys that you can hear on like most lists. Like we just put out the TSN list today. And I was a part of putting that together, and it's like basically most lists seem to have, the same 13 guys kind of towards the top that you among the people that you talk to. And so that doesn't change the top 15 all that much, but it, if that pick at 25 could change things. And like, there's all those different kind of factors that you put into play. So, I mean, everything changes everything is the short answer. Like any small change does create that little butterfly effect. But in the end, I think, I'm not going for 100% accuracy. So, because if I did, I would not be talking to you guys. I would be like the richest draft evaluator in the history of the world. I don't know how much that gets you actually. But I probably still would just talk to you guys anyway, because I enjoy it. But it's just, it's a very, I just understand that my mock drafts will never be 100% accurate.
Do you then, like, as an evaluator, kind of like you almost like take more pride in your evaluations of players than where you slot them to teams? Because I feel like it's almost 2 different things, right? Like you can be spot on with how you evaluate players. That's the kind of reward that almost doesn't come to fruition for like 5-6 years. Like you might think you're spot on with evaluation right now, but in reality, we'd have no idea how that evaluation plays out for 6-7 years, right?
Yes, exactly. So like I used to do like redrafts and different things like that. And then all of a sudden I started realizing I was redrafting too early. And all of a sudden that my original opinion was fine. Or it was, or it was
redraft your redraft,
or it was, you have to redraft the redraft, or you have to go. And I think it's a fun exercise because like it's like basically a snapshot of where those players are now or where they are when you do that piece. So I do think there's some value in that, because it also reminds you that development is not a straight line. It does not go linearly for anybody. And the thing is that some guys are going to go way up. Some guys are going to go down. Some guys have plateaued already. They're as good as they're ever going to be. And that's the end of it. And so, I think that that's kind of one of the things that you have to kind of look at and just kind of understand is that, and Zach, to your point, like I do take a lot more, like I really don't care if I get a mock draft 100% right. There's not enough reporting I can do that will get me to a level of accuracy that is reflective of what the actual draft order is. I do care about being right about the players, or at least close enough to being right about the players, and that my process of getting there was better. Because that's the biggest thing, is like every single draft is a learning experience. I have made plenty of similar mistakes, but it's hard to make the same mistake twice once you've done it, with the draft. And the thing is that you realize is like you may have learned a mistake on one player, and you thought you would not make that mistake on another player, only to realize that you were focusing on the wrong thing entirely. So like, it's just really, it's a fascinating process to go through this, because we're talking about players that still have much more maturation ahead of them, more hockey ahead of them, decisions that they're going to make that are going to impact everything else about their game. There's so much variable. There's so many variables that you have to consider, but you want to try to be as right as humanly possible, or at the very least wrong less.
We recently had a conversation with Mark Yannetti, director of amateur scouting, and he was pretty revealing when he talked about the industry's short-sightedness when it comes to players like Lane Hutson specifically. When you're evaluating a player, I know from my own personal experience, as much as I maybe don't want to let other people's opinions sway mine, there's a tipping point where if enough people say something, and I mean, this has been studied, right? I can't remember the name of the phenomenon, but if you're in a room full of people and you're shown a red cube and they ask you what color it is, you'll say red until you're in a room with 100 people telling you it's blue, at which point you just say blue to not be the one person standing out. Like how much does, if you have a guy falling from a draft spot, or we've been looking at some of the draft picks, and, there's one guy, I forget his name now, but he was originally slated to go 6th or 7th round, and now he's being picked in the 1st round by a lot of people. Like what tools do you have to stop that kind of, groupthink from sneaking into your evaluations?
Yeah, boy, it's hard. It's definitely hard. I think that you have to, you have to have your own set of kind of values in terms of how you evaluate a player. Like, what are the things that matter to you? What are the things that don't matter as much? And also, I think you have to understand, I think the people that do what I do, there should be some level of similarity to what is happening at the NHL. Like, you can be different, but I think that in order to tell the story of the draft and in order to evaluate the draft, you kind of have to try to think more like NHL teams, which is why you might see sometimes where it's like, all right, well, I know that I like this player. Like Lane Hutson is one I didn't really compromise on. That was a player I was like, he is a 1st round prospect. I had him in the 20s, I think, which that is still too low. Like, that's still too low. And he's, he didn't go until 62 or whatever. And or 50 something. So he's a really, he's a good example, because the probability of a Lane Hutson is low if you only looked at the measurables, right? That he's got a lot of points, that he's got skill, but you're looking at the height and you're saying, okay, the probability of that guy being a top 4 defenseman is really, really low, even as good as he is. But are there things that make him an exception to the rule? And in Lane Hutson's case, the skating made him an exception. His compete level made him an exception. And he really is one of the best puck handlers among any skater, so you're just like, all right, well, there's at least 3 things there that I can pinpoint to say that he's an exception to the rule. And I think we're going to see that with like Vigo Bjork this year. And I think NHL teams are starting to come around on that player too, because his compete level is as high as anybody's in this draft. His hockey sense is probably higher than anybody's in this draft. And he's got this ability to just know how to play. His hockey sense and then just putting that into practice has been pretty impressive. And for a small guy, he's pretty strong. So you say, all right, well, this guy can be an exception to the rule. Picking those players out is really difficult, because there are things that you can look at and say, okay, well, this guy's going to do this, this, and this, and that's great. But you don't know until you see it. And really, even Lane Hutson, when he was absolutely torching college hockey, he's not going to do that at the NHL. Just like they said he's not going to do that in college when he was doing it in junior. Just like they said he's not going to do it at the NTDP like he was doing it as a U16. Like, that's the thing, is like some of those guys, they will just continue to defy the odds. So, you got to just try to make sure that you are strong in your convictions about what you believe is important, and then not, and I think like it's hard not to read boards and be like, man, am I just like way off on this? Am I completely wrong? But it's like, you can also become okay with being wrong, And the thing is that the readers will let you know, but I already know that I put more work in on that. Like, I'm like, that's fine. And you might still be right, even with the less amount of work. And maybe sometimes I did too much and overthought it. But I think it's really funny how, you kind of get to that stage and it's like you can put in all that work and it's like somebody that's watched one highlight video is going to have a different opinion. So, yeah. And there's nothing wrong with that. Watch highlight videos, preferably on FloHockey.
Might as well get the views.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. So Chris, I want to shift to the Kings a little bit. And
sure.
Kings are scheduled to pick as of now higher than they have in a very long time in the first round, pick number 17. The prospect pool is in an interesting place because there aren't a ton of higher end players minus the goaltenders. A lot more, on the depth front, guys who will probably make the NHL maybe in a lower role. When you have a pick that you haven't had in a while, does having that kind of, I don't want to say emptiness, but not having a ton of guys at any one position other than in net, does that make it maybe easier or more of a priority for the Kings to truly focus on like a best player available kind of approach? Because there's really not a player that they can pick who won't be the best player in their pool at that position.
Yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't take any of the pressure off of getting it right. When you have a pick in the teens, I think it's a tricky spot because there is a chance to hit a major home run. And there is still that it's less likely that you strike out completely in that range anymore, but it is still a possibility. And so there's a lot of pressure in getting that one right, especially when you haven't had one at that range. What I'll say is that this draft class in particular is going to give you a multitude of options, many of them very good, many of them that maybe you'd say, okay, well, I'm not sure if that guy would have been available in this range in a prior draft year, or maybe I wouldn't even consider that guy in this range in a prior draft year. It goes both ways, but it does create this opportunity where it's like, hey, our list is our list. We've done all the work to get there. Why go anywhere to deviate just to reach for a position here or there? And that's what I think you see. And one thing that's really important, I think fans get wrapped up in the best player available, and you have to understand how different that is for every single team, which there's no consensus. There's no, especially after the first 15 picks this year, there's zero consensus. And so it's all beauty in the eye of the beholder, but also it's all the work that has been done and things like what is available in our prospect system. What is the timeline of our other players? What are the kinds of guys that play the style that we want to play? Do we have a type? Do we have, every team has a type of guy that they're going to value higher than other teams. And so is that guy available in this range? Those are the questions that I think you'll ask. I think the Kings have really good options here, like really good options, players that are going to be at the top of their prospect system. Do I think any one of them is going to be a franchise changer? I don't, but I do think that those are players that will make an impact down the road. And so getting it right is obviously really important, but I think, the Kings traditionally have had a staff that have, just as all teams do, they all put the work in. They all put the work in, right? They all do what's necessary. But the question is whose process is correct and who's going to bring the most fruit. And I think, this is a good position for the Kings to be in.
Complicating everything Zach said about the position the Kings are in is the fact that whoever they take at 17 isn't likely to crack the NHL lineup in the next year or 2 or 3.
Probably 2, yeah. At least,
maybe even 5.
2. Yeah.
So with a coach who's got a 3-year contract, a GM who's got 2 years left on what was presumed to be a 3-year contract, and some pretty high-profile names with 1 or 2 years left on their contracts, when you're evaluating who the Kings are going to take, like Rob Blake was GM for 8 years? Dean Lombardi was GM for 11. You could kind of imagine what a player drafted where they might fit into the Kings organization 5, 6, 7 years down the road. I have no idea what the LA Kings needs are going to be 5 years from now, much less 3 years from now. So, I mean, how do you evaluate? Are we just going off of Marchianetti's track record at this point?
I think so. I mean, to a certain extent, it's like, trust in your scouts and what is who's the best player available for us and what, regardless of position, regardless of, the other things at play. It's just like, let's just make sure that we're getting the right player. I don't think you can be overly picky in the teens or the 20s or anything like that in the draft. You just kind of have to go with what's available to you. And in this year's class, the Kings are like right on the outside of the edge of where, like, I feel like there's consensus where, I think it's like 13, 14 is really like, there's guys that I might have 14, 15, 16 that could be there at 17. I don't know if any of the guys that I have up to 13 will be there, like that kind of thing. And you never know, but I do think like the likelihood of them getting somebody that kind of falls into their laps is still pretty high. So I'm intrigued by it, but I think, yes, you trust in your scouts and I don't think, like, I've heard teams that have said, okay, we're going to draft to a certain identity. And sometimes that identity is tied to the head coach. And I was like, that guy's probably not coaching them. Like,
Right.
There's almost no way that guy's coaching them. And it's like, so what is the style? Like, just get a good player. And I generally think that that's what the Kings do, is they're going after that player that they feel is the best fit for them at that appropriate range.
So then, looking at that TSN mock draft that you referenced earlier, I'm going to start at 13 just because you said it's possible. We've got Wyatt Collin at 13, Oscar Hemming at 14, Oliver Suvanto at 15, Alexander, is it Command?
Command, yeah.
Command.
Well, it's probably Command. I don't know, but
who knows?
Command.
It's Swedish. 16,
yeah.
And then Novotny at 17, Ryan Lynn at 18, Ilya Morozov at 19, Nikita Klepov at 20. Those are all names I've heard people talk about at various different times. And, different people have different preferences. I'm going to keep banging the Oliver Suvanto drum. How confident are you that an Adam Novotny would be there at 17 and would be the right kind of pick for the LA Kings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I think there's a strong chance that he's there. I wouldn't say it's probable or likely. I would just say that there's a strong chance that he's there, because that's a range that I think is kind of acceptable. The questions are, does the offense translate well enough? Is there, does he do any one thing at a truly elite level, or is it more just kind of a well-rounded player that has probably a pretty high floor and the ability to fit into a variety of roles? That's certainly possible. You look at other guys that are, even further down that list, you say, okay, well, Nikita Klepov has this incredible skill level. He's got all these different abilities. Like, is that what we're looking for? He doesn't have great size, compete levels a little bit in and out. Like, does that make sense? Or you look at Savanto. Savanto probably has, of all those players, maybe the highest floor of them all. Does he have the upside? He hasn't scored a whole lot. He hasn't been a consistent, effective scorer. Does that fit? I think he's going to play in the NHL for quite a long time, because I think that he's a big, strong, two-way guy that will impact the game in a variety of ways, and that versatility is going to speak to some teams. But I think any one of those guys that you mentioned brings some level of ability that would help. Like Command, I think would be a great pick in that range if he's available. He's a center. He's competitive. He's physical. He can score. I think he checks a lot of the boxes, and I think he could potentially be there. He is a name that has risen probably since the combine a little bit, as in terms of guys that could be going a little bit ahead of where they're at. But I think when you're in that range, you look at all those names you read off. I was like, there's tons of good options there. There's tons of good opportunities for the team to get better. Probably any one of them, like you said, will be at the top of the prospect pool at this point. And are they going to be, franchise changers? Unlikely. Are they going to be impactful? Yes. And so that's a good thing. And I think that's the ideal circumstance that you come away with.
Just to jump in real quick. Sorry, Zach. Command is the one I was referencing when I said I'd heard of him as being a 6th or 7th round pick, who is now being talked about as going middle of the first. And that's,
nobody really,
that is a huge rising player.
I think until the Hlinka Gretzky. So the Hlinka Gretzky Cup was the first time, or I think it was even after that, but he jumped out and people were like, oh, look at this guy. And then he went to the world under 18s, was like, okay, he's top 15, top 15, top 20, no doubter at that point. And I think like in this draft, it's like there's so much where it's like, I mean, there are guys that I think could go in the top 20 that might not go until 60, just because maybe enough teams don't like them. And the exact opposite is true too. That's the nature of the draft. It's crazy.
So Chris, I'm going to throw out a kind of a hypothetical just because I was going to ask this anyway, but what you just said actually changes it a little bit. So the Kings' MO the last 2 years has been very simple. They have had a first. They have not had a second. They've traded down in the first round to collect a second.
Mm-hmm.
Mark Yannetti has stated on the record his preference philosophically is to trade down. You usually win the trade a lot more when you move down, and you can a lot of times stick with a player in that same tier based on what you've talked about, how teams have players rated differently. However, you also used a number of like 13 players, which is 4 picks above where the Kings are at. You then said that there might be, a player who goes at 20 who could go at 60. So you could see where I'm going with this. Like, does it almost make more sense to you? Okay, do you take less picks and try to get one of those top players? Or would you say, oh, well, maybe if you stay where you're at, the Kings could, in theory, if they play it well, they could get 3 players they have with a first round grade with their first and 2 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, it's always a risk. I think that it just kind of depends on how, like, all these guys are trying to figure out at the same time, like, where everybody else is picking, because you're not just trying to think about, we think we can get this guy here. You're also thinking about what are the other teams that could prevent us from doing that, and how do we make sure that doesn't happen? And there's a number of ways to do it. Like, it's always fascinating right when you get to the draft, and I always wonder how some of these trades come together as quickly as they do. But a lot of teams do have their board. They're like, we know that these picks are this value to us, and this is what we think we could get out of it from this team. And they go down their list, and they're able to have that strategy and find those players. I think in general, having more picks is probably better. But I think in this year's class, like there's no one I truly like. There's not a lot of players I get very excited about in this class. And that's maybe I've said, like, maybe it's because I've been doing this for too long, and like I'm just starting to get a little more jaded when it comes to these players. I mean, that's certainly possible. But I also think, like, there are definitely, I've seen, years where I'm much more excited or intrigued by players in this range. But, Mark is right. Like, in general, trading back is typically going to be the better play, and I think that that's something that the Kings have done a little bit. The Carolina Hurricanes have done it more than probably anybody. And you find guys, I mean, and you're hoping, like, the odds of you getting an everyday NHLer out of the late second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth round is low. So you still have to do your due diligence there. And so, yeah, it's a tough, like, they're in a very intriguing position. I think, like, if they stand pat and pick a player, they're going to be very happy with what they end up having. And I don't think you want to go too far outside of, like, being ahead of 20 this year feels like a good spot.
I want to just sort of add layers to Zach's hypothetical, because
sure,
now that we know that Ottawa has made the move for Brady Tkachuk, and now, 9, I had heard that Florida, I had heard rumors that Florida might have been interested in moving 9, I don't know, a month ago or something like that.
Yeah.
Now that we see Ottawa and,
move 9, the second game 82 ended, right?
Right. Yeah. So now that we know that Ottawa has all these extra draft picks, but no second round pick, and the Kings have 2 second round picks, if a player like, and I'm just going to completely make things up, if a player like Bjork or Malhotra, which wouldn't have a chance of falling to 17, falls to 9, and I asked Mark this question, and he, sort of the groundwork of what Zach was saying, which is that his position is generally speaking to trade back. But if he didn't think anybody would fall, I think he used the number 13 because I didn't give it a specific number. He said, like, if they're not falling to 13, they're not, or if they're not falling out of the top 10, they're not falling to, into a position close enough for the Kings to move up to grab it.
Right.
But if it was a player like Bjork or Malhotra, who is highly ranked, falls to 9, and that wouldn't take that much to happen.
Right.
We saw Gabe Perreault a few years ago fall into the 20s, I think it was.
Yeah.
At some point, you just sell out your strategy for the player that you're in love with, no?
you'd really have to be in love with them. I think you'd have to say this is the most hand-to-glove fit. This guy is the most Los Angeles Kings player I've ever seen in my life. And, because I think getting into the top 10 this year is going to be expensive.
Mm-hmm.
Brady Tkachuk was.
Florida just
expensive.
Did it.
Yeah,
or Ottawa just did it.
Ottawa did it at the expense of their captain.
Sure.
So and that's. Yeah, and I think you look at I think even there are a couple teams like you think about like Chicago and other teams like that are just loaded with prospects, and it's like what use do you have for a 4th overall pick? Well, everybody's got use for a 4th overall pick, right? But still, like that's a team where it's like, all right, I think there's plenty of teams that have that capability to potentially trade back, and if the price is right, you can do it. But I tend to agree. I think that it's a lot harder to make those trades now, giving up assets and really taking a big swing. And like in the case of like Vigo Bjork in particular, a 5'9" center, like I love Vigo Bjork. He's one of my favorite players in this draft, but like, it's like, are you going to take that swing on that player with that amount of risk attached to it? Like same thing, like even like Lane Hudson, would you have done that for Lane Hudson? I mean, if you knew what you know now, yes, but not really, not at the time. Certainly.
Sorry to jump in and interrupt, but it's easy to say that, and yet not every year, but every now and then there seems to be a Moritz Seider where it's like, oh, I'd never even heard of that guy before, and he's going 6th overall.
Right, and then it works out completely. And I mean, I think that's a huge credit to the scouts that make those decisions and everything, and those guys that are saying like, hey, this is our guy, and if he's there, we go get him. And I wonder the prices being what they are now. Like, I think it's, at the expense of a potential roster player at that point too. Like, like there's a lot of moving up. Seems like it's going to be very expensive.
I mean, I guess that's always the hanging issue is what is the cost. And it's funny to me. I see all these people talk about, it's starting to get really, I'm the older I get, the less I like the off season, because there's always like, oh, well, yeah, go ahead and move player X, assuming the cost isn't that big a deal. And it's like, right, well, you've just hand waved away the biggest part of your hypothetical.
The cost is severe. Yeah, I mean, like that's really, like that's definitely one of the things where it's just like, you gotta, like, making trades is hard, and we're seeing the trades happen a little bit more now, which is great, but it's like the odds of you getting, the value of what you can get from the draft is often not there. Like most teams don't build decors without having at least 2 to 3 homegrown players on it. So it's like, it can happen. I mean, I think I'm pretty sure Carolina's is pretty much not homegrown except for like Slavin and a couple. So, like there's a variety of ways to build a team, but I think, protecting your draft capital and making sure that you're using it properly is a big one.
Chris, I just had one more. We've talked a lot about 17, which is obviously the most notable pick that the Kings have. They also have 46. They have 49. They have, I think, 79. So 3 in the top 50, 4 in the top 80. If you could go into the crystal ball a little, maybe just a few names to look out for at those spots. When you look at the Kings pool, we talked about it. There's a lot of openings for different guys. Who are some guys you think might be good Kings fits, or just some guys that you like who are maybe not getting that first round buzz, but in a year like this could be of interest around that, 46, 49 range?
Yeah. I mean, it comes back to, who's going to fall and where are they going to go? Cause I think it's so unpredictable when you get to that stage. So I tend to look almost pessimistically kind of down my own list and say, oh, I probably should go a little bit lower than that. But like, couple guys to just kind of keep an eye on, I think in like the 40s range, like Alexander Bilecki is a defenseman for the Kitchener Rangers, had a like kind of underrated year and then really popped in the playoffs. And then he's got some skill level. He's got some mobility, played top 4 minutes for the Memorial Cup champion. I mean, like that's a pretty good place to be for a young player like him. Really intrigued by him for sure. I look at some of the other guys in that range. Samu Alalari, a Finnish defenseman, moves pucks pretty well. He's been kind of moving up on some of the lists, maybe in the late 30s. That's a player that I think, if you're looking for a guy that can move pucks and defend and do those things, he could be a potential option there. If you're looking for guys that are potentially falling out of the first round, like Ryan Robrek is, big body, I don't know if he necessarily fits the Kings profile, but he definitely has. He scored 40 goals in his draft -1. His numbers went down this year. That's usually not a good sign. However, he's 6'4". He's got offensive sense. It's just, can he get that compete level up in order to make it happen? Another guy that I'm really intrigued by and really not sure where he's going to end up, could go in the first round, could go in the second, is Igor Shilov from the Victoriaville Tigers. He's just a really intelligent player in terms of his offensive sense. Teams have been a little bit surly about his compete level and different things about, getting a little frustrated by him, but he does have this offensive ability, and he does have some size to him as well, which I think teams aren't necessarily going to shy away from. But yeah, there's a lot of different names that you could kind of I could just keep throwing names at you guys, and there's a lot on there, but it's difficult to know who's really going to be there when we have so much uncertainty really from the teens on.
Last question from me. How many picks do the Kings wind up making on draft day? They currently have 9. There's no way.
I doubt they make all of them, but yeah. I mean, I think that I think those 3 picks in the top 50, those are the ones you really want to, focus on. And there could be a way to package those. There could be a way to, package whatever or trade down again. But I think that there's those are, especially those second rounders. I feel like that's fodder for, or could be fodder for, making some moves. And I think teams would be amenable to that. And there's a lot of other stuff out there, but yeah, I mean, it just seems like we could be in for a chaotic week, given the whole chuck of it all and everything else. I think that we're gonna find out soon what that looks like, and it's just gonna mean that every time I make a mock draft, I'm gonna have to redo it. So that's the way it goes.
Well, I hope your delete button holds up under the strain.
It's worn already.
Chris Peters, thank you so much for joining us. As always, appreciate it, and hopefully we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for watching, Kings fans.